Chrom is the main character of the game, and as such, if he dies, it is an immediate game over. However, unlike some main characters, Chrom is perfectly capable of handling himself. He is in fact very good. As you can see by his growths there, he has good, solid stats in strength, skill, and speed, as well as very high luck, with his only real weakness being relatively low resistance, and that -1 to the defense cap. His defense growth is not actually that bad, and his defense base is pretty good. It's the same as his strength base, but he does have, again, a -1 there, showing that defense is meant to be one of his weaker stats, so later in the game, he will have some issues in that area. Now, his strength, skill, and speed growths are all 60, which I generally consider to be above average for this game. Yeah, growths are so high in Awakening overall that a growth rate of 60 is merely above average, but that's still pretty decent for his purposes, since strength, skill, and speed are the main stats that a physical user will need. I mean, his magic growth is terrible, but that's pointless since he doesn't have any magic-using classes as options. And his HP is relatively average. Now, something that I forgot to mention in the avatar's profile. The HP growths I have here, I actually had to scale them down a bit to match the scale of the other stats. Because if I actually put the real HP growths on this chart, it would make the other stats look way too low, since HP growths in general are much, much higher. So what I did was, I subtracted 20 from both the base and the class growth for HP. So if you want the character's full HP growth, you have to add 40. So for example here, Chrom's actual HP growth is 85%, which is generally considered around average for this game. Many characters have HP growths of 100 or above, so that's why I couldn't really put it on the same scale as other stats. His cap modifiers, again, are also decent all around as far as physical users are concerned, having +1 to strength, skill, speed, and luck, although admittedly, you'd think his luck cap would be a bit higher considering that's his best stat, but I guess that's what you kind of get for having relatively balanced stats elsewhere. Again, like I've mentioned, -1 to defense and resistance can kind of hurt later on, but in general, Chrom is still pretty solid. Now, one of the main things that makes Chrom useful, especially early on, is his Falchion. This is a weapon that only Chrom can use, and the main reason why it's so important is that it has infinite uses. Early on in the game, this is pretty much fantastic, as it means that Chrom can basically fight anything without the need for breakable weapons, really. And its power is pretty much decent for early in the game. Its stats are effectively identical to an iron sword, so it's basically an infinite use iron sword. But being identical to an iron sword, past the mid-game, the Falchion starts to get kind of weak. And by late game, it's really, really weak, so you will need to give Chrom other weapons over the course of the game, because eventually the Falchion just won't cut it. I mean, it is nice to have an infinite use iron sword, but then again, it's still an iron sword. There's much better swords available. Note though that the Falchion is actually effective against dragon units, just like it was in Marth's games. And this does include Wyvern Riders, though for this game, Wyvern Riders are really the only thing that it's useful against. Because, unlike in New Mystery of the Emblem, you don't actually fight generic dragon enemies or Manaketes, unless you're playing spot pass battles against other people's teams, where they'll use their own Manaketes, but yeah, there are no non-playable as in enemy Manaketes in this game, again outside of spot pass and DLC, so while the Falchion is effective against them, that really won't come into play most of the time. However, against Wyvern Riders, that effectiveness bonus is quite good, mainly because you will be seeing a lot of Wyvern Riders eventually. Quite a few of the enemy nations actually have a fondness for Wyvern Riders, so you'll be seeing them surprisingly early, and it is definitely very useful. But the weird thing about the Falchion is, it getting less and less useful over the course of the game kind of mirrors Chrom himself. Chrom is very good early on, but later in the game he kind of suffers from being, well, decent all round, but not fantastic in any real area. He sort of suffers from jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none syndrome, and while that is pretty good overall, he does have problems when characters join later who kind of are fantastic in certain areas and sort of blow him out of the water, especially his own children. That's really the main area where you kind of see it. His children are going to outclass him badly. Thankfully, though, he won't need to worry about that for quite some time. And yes, despite the fact that he gets a little bit less useful later into the game, he is still forced in every chapter, and that is kind of annoying. But still, for someone who's forced in every chapter, he's at least miles better than Roy. And now, class options. Yes, you heard me right, class options. Unlike in Shadow Dragon, the main Lord is actually able to reclass in this game, amazing as it seems. He can switch to the Cavalier or Archer lines using a second seal at any time, and this is a first for a Fire Emblem main character. Does this help him? Well, first let's talk about Chrom's main class, the Lord, because that is exclusive to him, with one exception, that... spoilers. But anyway, Chrom starts off as a Lord, and in this he comes with the Dual Strike Plus skill right off the bat, which adds 10% to the chance of a Dual Strike. This is a very, very useful skill, mostly early on in the game, but it is pretty good all throughout. An extra 10% chance of your ally giving an extra attack to your combat is definitely a good thing, but again, it's especially useful early on when Dual Strike rates are fairly low overall. Of course, once you get later in the game and Chrom gets married and pairs up with his wife or even children, you'll start hitting Dual Strike rates in the 70% range or higher, so it does get pretty insane later on. He's nearly guaranteed to get support from his allies in battle, so that skill really helps out. The next skill he learns as a Lord is Charm, which players of Fire Emblem 4 might know as Charisma. Sadly, this skill has been nerfed a bit since the 4th game. It only provides a hit and avoid +5 to allies within a 3-tile radius rather than +10. But still, it's alright, considering that you're always going to use Chrom in every chapter, so of course he has plenty of opportunities to make use of this. Avoid +5 is not really all that much, but it could save someone's life. Chrom then promotes to Master Lord. Now this is something that I need to explain. Unlike nearly every single other Lord in the Fire Emblem series, Chrom's promotion is not tied to the story progression. He promotes pretty much the exact same way as a regular character, by using a Master Seal at level 10 or above in his base class. Yeah, pretty much just the same as any old regular character. You don't need to worry about story progression at all. You can promote Chrom at any time you want, provided that he's the right level. Actually, there's an interesting quirk about Chrom's promoted class's battle model, but I'll explain that a bit later because it's kind of a bit of a spoiler right now. But upon promoting to Great Lord, Chrom's first skill that he learns is Ether. Yes, people who played Ike's game should be very familiar with that skill, where it was basically Ike's signature move. Ether looks very different to Ike's version, but it works in pretty much the same way. When it activates, your one attack becomes 2 attacks, the first hit having a soul effect, so healing you for as much damage as you do to the enemy, and the second hit having a lunar effect, so calculating damage at half the enemy's defense. It pretty much goes without saying that this is a very, very good skill. Its only real weakness is the fact that its activation rate is lower than many other activation-based skills. It's only half your skill stat percent rather than your full skill stat, which means that, yeah, Chrom's maximum skill is 41, so at maximum it only has a 20% chance of activating. But there is something that can help that. This second skill that Chrom learns is Rightful King, which adds a flat 10% chance to all activation rates of skills that have activation rates. This is actually very significant for Ether, because like I said before, Ether's maximum activation rate normally is only 20%, so increasing it by 10% is basically multiplying its chances by 1.5, which is pretty huge, giving him a 30% chance of an Ether on any attack, and considering how powerful Ether is, that is really useful to have. Unfortunately, Chrom only has 2 other skills that actually benefit from Rightful King, but some of his children can certainly make excellent use of this skill too. Speaking of other skills that he has, Chrom's other class options are Cavalier and Archer. Cavalier, well, that has the interesting benefit of giving the main character a mount, and of course, since he can still use swords, he can still use the Falchion in this class. Basically, regardless of what class it is, as long as it can use swords, he can still use the Falchion. And, I mean, it is decent giving the main lord a mount. You might think, oh hey, that'll help me seize quicker. Actually, no. There are no seize missions in this game, strangely enough, which is kind of bizarre by the standards of the series, but that's how it goes. Also, unlike Marth's games, anyone can visit villages, so you don't have any extra benefits there. But you do have all the general benefits of being a mounted unit, alongside the Discipline skill, which doubles weapon experience gain, which can be kind of useful, but Chrom really only has access to, well, he has access to a couple of weapon types, but I guess Discipline could be kind of okay. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that Chrom gains access to lances when he promotes to Great Lord, so that could be useful for improving his lance rank, which will need a bit of buffing up when he promotes, because he'll start at an E rank. He can promote to Paladin or Great Knight, and each of these classes has a skill that benefits from Rightful King. Paladin has Aegis, which will halve the damage from bows, magic, or dragon stones, and this is really useful because, like I said before, Chrom's resistance is a bit low, so he has a bit of a vulnerability to magic. Rightful King should add, if I'm correct about this, a 10% chance of activation to this skill, so it helps him both offensively and defensively, so it's definitely a good skill to have. The Great Knight class has access to Luna, which is kind of weird. You might be thinking, what's the point of having Chrom have Luna when Aether is basically the same thing, just better? Well, the thing about Luna is that unlike Aether, Luna's activation rate is your full skill stat percent rather than half your skill stat. So it actually activates more often, and even more often than normal with the addition of Rightful King. In fact, having Rightful King with Chrom at max skill will give Luna pretty much a 50% chance of activating, which is very, very good. Now, notably about this, Luna and Aether can't activate at the same time. There's a hierarchy of skills. Basically, activation skills have a priority list in when they activate. Now, Aether does have higher priority over Luna, so what Luna basically is if Chrom does learn it, it works as an insurance policy in case Aether doesn't activate. If Aether doesn't activate, the game will then roll the random number for Luna to see if that activates. So, you've got a pretty decent chance of getting at least one super move off. The Great Knight class for Chrom also learns the Dual Guard Plus skill, which will actually combine with Chrom's Dual Strike Plus, making him very effective when paired up with other units, especially those that he has high support ranks with. So that's generally a very good thing to have. Not only that, but Paladin will help from this too, giving it the Protector skill, which will increase all of his stats by 1 whenever he's paired up with someone. So Chrom's skills really do revolve around the pair-up system. No wonder he appears as Robin's final smash in the Smash Bros. Series, using pair-up. Now, Chrom's other option is Archer, and admittedly I've never actually tried using this because, to me, I really don't see why you'd make a sword-wielding main character an Archer, a class that can't counterattack at close combat. It just is kind of weird. It's Chrom's only class option where he can't even use the Falchion, and again, I'm not really sure why you do this. Archer is not a great class at all. Its promoted options are pretty good, but Archer itself is not that great, so I would recommend waiting until he's promoted and then reclassing him straight to Sniper or Bow Knight, because Archer itself is kinda I mean, it does get the Prescient skill, which helps you on the player phase, but I mean, Chrom has much better options than that skill. Sniper, hit rate plus 20. Why is it that Intelligent Systems has this obsession with giving snipers hit rate increasing skills when they don't need it? They already hit all the time anyway. But Bowfair, again, this skill's only going to help Chrom when he's in the Archer line, and you probably don't want him to be in the Archer line for very long, so not really all that useful. Bow Knight, though, he'll actually be able to use the Falchion, as you can tell from that portrait, which is good. And I would much prefer this to Archer, but even then, really the main reason to go here is, even Rally skill is not all that great since it's the only Rally skill that Chrom learns, so Rallies are much better when you combine them with other Rally skills, and since Chrom only gets 1, it's not exactly the best. Bowbreaker is alright, but, really, Hit and avoid plus 50 against bows. I mean, Chrom being a sword user decimates enemy archers anyway, so not sure why you'd really need that, and Chrom himself, it doesn't particularly mind getting targeted by archers. I mean, he's not a flying unit at all, so Bowbreaker is great for some other characters, but not really for Chrom. So for Chrom, I would recommend sticking to the Cavalier line when it comes to reclass options, but his main Lord classes are very good too. Now, speaking of skills and classes in terms of Chrom, one thing that I need to mention about Chrom is his inheritance. Now, normally, parents pass down one skill to their children, and you get control over what that skill is. With Chrom, though, his skill inheritance is actually automatic. You don't need to worry about this at all. Basically, here's how it works. Chrom's daughters will always inherit Ether, and his sons will always inherit Rightful King. They'll inherit these even if Chrom himself doesn't know the skill yet, so he's unique in that regard. Oh, and if males inheriting Rightful King sounds sexist to you, Rightful King was called Royal Weapon in the Japanese version, so it didn't have any gender implications there. Kind of a weird thing, that. Also, speaking of Chrom, I need to talk briefly about his marriage options here. Chrom is relatively unique in that he's the only character who you are forced to marry to someone for plot reasons. Everyone else, marriage is completely optional, but you'd be insane not to do it given the benefits it gives you. With Chrom though, Chrom will automatically marry the character he has the highest support with at the end of a certain, well, I guess I'll say the chapter right here, since if you're on these pages you probably don't care that much about spoilers anyway. Chapter 11. And there are only so many characters he can actually marry. Chrom has a completely restricted list of potential suitors. He can't just marry any female character, there are actually only 5 that he can, and one of them is extremely difficult to do without actually preparing in advance. I'll discuss Chrom's marriage options on those characters' individual stat sheets when they join. However, the female avatar is a marriage option for Chrom, and you might have wondered, why didn't I discuss that in the avatars entry? Put simply, it is downright unfair to compare any avatar pairing to any other one. The avatar gives their children access to every skill in the game, and, well, not so much every skill in the game, but every class option in the game, and thus every skill they can use, gender permitting. This is just downright ridiculous, and it's just unfair to compare that to anything else. So technically speaking, the Avatar is Chrom's best pairing, but the Avatar's everyone's best pairing, so doesn't really count there. Instead, I'll be focusing on discussing all the other marriage options for Chrom, because they're the ones that really can actually be compared with each other. And I won't be discussing any other marriages. The only reason why I'm discussing Chrom's is because you have to marry him, he has a limited pool of suitors, so it kinda makes sense to do that. But anyway, I'll be discussing that later when those characters start joining, but for now, that's it for Chrom. But first, a bit of trivia about voice actors. Chrom is voiced by Matthew Mercer, and he's been in quite a few roles lately. 2013 was a very, very big year for him because he not only played Chrom, but also quite a few other major roles in gaming and in anime. You might know him as Walter in Shin Megami Tensei 4, Kanji Tatsumi in the Persona series, whenever Troy Baker isn't available. He's basically a stand-in for Troy Baker there, but he does such a good job of imitating Troy Baker that you really couldn't tell if you didn't actually read in advance that it wasn't Troy Baker. Really, I actually give him serious props for that. His kanji voice actually sounds nothing like his Chrom voice as well, so he's actually pretty good at it. And Alvin the Traitor in Tales of Exilia. Now, Alvin is a particularly notable case because he shares his voice actor with Chrom in both Japanese and English. He's voiced by Matthew Mercer in English and Tomokazu Sugita in Japanese, who voices Chrom in the Japanese version. So that's kind of hilarious. Also, yeah, Alvin really needs to meet up with Nesala sometime. I think they'd have a lot to talk about. Matthew Mercer also directed the web series There Will Be Brawl, and he played Ganondorf in that, I believe.